Good morning, all. Afternoon. Whenever you're watching this, this is a short. This will be a very short video. Uh, this, that will discuss or give some background to the Diane Ravitch text, "Reign of Error." Uh, for the most part, uh, Ravitch's argument in this text is straightforward and accessible. If you look at the assignment, I'm giving you her central idea, and what you have to do is basically explain how she is arguing what she's arguing. Uh, and let me just read from the assignment sheet itself. In Reign of Error, Ravitch argues that the current corporate reformist agenda rests upon the false premise that American public education is in crisis. Furthermore, she argues that this corporate reform agenda not only fails according to its own standards of measurement, but really is a disguised way by which to privatize public schooling so as to generate monetary profit for private interest. First, explain what evidence, what facts Ravitch employs to argue that the entire reform effort is based upon the false premise of systemic educational failure. Second, explain what evidence Ravitch employs to argue that the reform effort is a backdoor way by which to privatize schooling. And third, evaluate her argument and her suggestions for improving public education. So, look, Ravitch's argument here is not a new argument by any means. Kenneth Saltman in The Failure of Corporate School Reform, and plenty of others. Alex Molnar. Alex Molnar has been doing this work since 1983, and as Ravitch points out, the modern version of her argument really has its roots in the 1983 Nation at Risk report. I'll come back to that in a second. Look, her argument is more accessible than, say, Saltman's, than Henry Giroux. Henry Giroux has been making this argument for decades now. Alex Molnar been making this argument for decades. Joe Kinchlow had been making this argument for a very long time. Shirley Steinberg. It goes on and on. I mean, there were plenty of people making the argument that Ravitch is making. What the Ravitch text is, she puts it in more accessible language, I think, straightforward language than, say, a Saltman or a Giroux, and avoid some of the more technical Marxist or critical theorist language that can bog folks down when attempting to understand, analyze, or argument. And it also is an insider's perspective on such a reform effort. It's kind of like Robert McNamara, who wrote, The Fog of War, whatever it was. McNamara. Oh no, we had it all wrong in Vietnam. And that's what Ravitch is doing here. Colleagues of mine say that why give her money by having students purchase her book. Well, in defending my choice here, is one is accessible. I think students struggle with, say, a corporate, Saltman's language, Biddle's language, or whatever. And this, Ravitch was a undersecretary of education during the Bush administration. Reagan, not Reagan, of course. Bush had worked in the, I think, Clinton administration a little bit. Ravitch has argued for accountability measures, high stakes testing. As this was influenced by the 1983 Nation at Risk report, while in the 1983 Nation at Risk report, and I've mentioned this in other videos, it represents a modern version of a long-standing argument that American public schooling has failed society. I mean, this goes back to a couple points I've made in the beginning. Americans view education as the cure-all for all of its social ills, but will often point to education as the source of all its social problems. And various factions, particularly business, I mean, this is true of all factions, groups of people in American society, they want something out of their public schools, something that serves some particular interest. Most of the time, selfish interest under the guise of democratic, of the chivalrous of democracy, or rhetoric of democracy. That's not to say that groups don't want to bring to fruition or manifest, or want the public to manifest democratic principles and values. They do. But many groups have wanted, as we've seen in this course, want particular things out of public schooling. The business community, of course, wants particular things out of public schools, and has had tremendous influence in shaping, starting back in the really it can be traced to the 1830s and the beginnings of the Common School movement, but certainly by 1910, if you look at the Taylorization of public schools as an indication, American business has shaped the reasons to go to school and its practice. And so the claim in the 1983 Nation at Risk report that American public schooling has failed American society and has led to all the social problems, social, economic, and political problems that report enumerates, is in line with a long-standing claim that American public schools is a systemic failure. And Ravitch is pointing out that the current so-called crisis is similar. The sky is falling, and public schools are to blame for it. The current claim is that American students and the Nation at Risk report argued that the schools are generating a rising tide of mediocrity, and the current claim is that mediocrity has just continued. If we use as evidence students' standardized test scores. What Ravitch is pointing out in her first, 7, 8, I don't have the book in front of me, 8 chapters or so, by looking at the evidence that she has gathered from NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress data, and other data from the National Institute or National Center for Educational Statistics, is that that's not true. As she points out, scale scores, and the scale scores for students in mathematics and reading have gone up, steadily gone up. And for various groups, dropout rates have gone down, and then graduation rates have gone up. By every measure, students in schools have improved. Now, what those improvements mean is a matter of debate. It's a matter of human interpretation. But to say that the scores have gone down, dropout rates have increased, graduation rates have stagnated, simply contrary to fact. If facts mean anything in our decision making, then the facts would suggest that the whole claim that we're in crisis, that's a false claim. It's predicated on data that doesn't exist. So when the assignment asks you to explain what evidence she uses, you will want to enumerate or explain, not just simply list, but explain uh, what are the facts about student standardized test scores? What are the facts about achievement gaps? She has a nice chapter in the text about achievement gaps, historic achievement gaps between various groups. And as she points out in this, I mean, the data as well as qualitative data, quantitative as well as qualitative, reinforce this. Those achievement gaps we have closed throughout the 1970s into the 80s, when we as a country spent resources, time, human as well as physical resources, attempting to improve the educational quality for all students, African American students, Native American students, Asian American students, you name it. Our national focus was on equity, and improving standardized test scores for students, but the quality of education, not simply their performance on standardized tests. Those achievement gaps closed. By 1983, with the Nation at Risk report, Reagan's Secretary of Education suggested we've attempted to do too much too fast, and we have focused on equity, equality at the expense of excellence. And so the national focus and the state's focus, they're falling in line with that federal money, has been turned away from basically equality in schools, quality of experience, equity in educational experience. So what we start to see is those achievement gaps go right back to what they had been historically, before, in some way, not really before the integration of schools, but they've widened again, and they remain roughly 17, anywhere from 17 to 27 scale points, in difference. And we know why those achievement gaps exist. We know why. We've known why for, as she points out, for decades upon decades. It has more to do with poverty, access, and or lack of access to material resources. She has a chapter on facts about international test scores. Look, thing to keep in mind and read that. I mean, that's important to read that chapter and understand the facts, the evidence that she is employing. But we test. You have when in comparisons, when looking at comparisons or analyzing comparisons, test score comparisons between countries. What you want to know is what group of students are we comparing. Often, we're comparing apples to oranges, so to speak. That is, in this country, we measure, test, and aggregate every student in the country. We test everybody, and we include those scores. And then they're used in comparison to the elite in other countries. When social class is accounted for, our students do just as well, if not better, than students in comparable socioeconomic classes. Again, read that chapter. She has a chapter on facts about graduation rates, facts about teachers and test scores, a chapter on teachers and tenure. What are the facts? What are the facts? What is the evidence? What are the facts that Ravitch is using to argue that the entire reform effort is based upon a false premise of systemic educational failure? And then second, explain what facts Ravitch employs to argue that the reform effort is a backdoor way by which to privatize schooling for profit. And the point there is to generate profit off of an otherwise public function. Now, it's too complicated here to go into why this is the privatization of government is and governmental function, public function, has been a trend. You know, capitalism necessitates. If you, I can't do this here, but just quickly, capitalism requires a compound profit every cycle, economic cycle. Lack of compound growth, lack of compound profit is considered lack of growth, or you know, a stagnation, or you know, recession. Sorry, recession and depression. Capitalism has to find new modes, new markets, new spaces by which to squeeze out profit. Privatizing public function is one of those spaces. She's not necessarily making that more critical theorist or Marxist argument there. Or I mean, it doesn't have to be critical theorist or Marxist. I mean, Alex Molnar is no Marxist, but he points up that that our institutions in many ways are responsive and are in response, work in response to, you know, the modes of influences in larger society. And one of those primary influencers or influencing agents in society, or factors in society, is of course economic system called capitalism. And so what evidence does she use? What facts about Michelle Rhee, Teach for America, various entrepreneurial for-profit agencies that stand to make profit off of high-stakes testing, from test banks to remedial services under No Child Left Behind. Schools failed to make adequate yearly progress 2 years in a row. Those schools qualify for federal supplemental education funds that have to go to sources outside of the school. That is, the teachers inside the schools can't use those supplemental resources, that money, for themselves to remediate students. That has to be subbed out. For instance, a student in this very class years ago, this is, I don't know what year this was, 2010, 2011, 12, the school year, her daughter was attending a school in St. Lucie County, and received a letter in the mail. I don't know what I've done with the packet now. Oh, here we go. I'm going to have this right here. She gave this to me. Your child is eligible to receive free tutoring through the Supplemental Educational Services program for the 2011-2012 school year. Students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch and who attend Title I schools that failed to make adequate yearly progress for 2 or more consecutive years are eligible for these services. Now, this student was in a magnet, an IB program that was in a poor poor school, as we've talked about in various another place video, that's in the Kozel video. That tends to be where magnet programs, IB programs, and so forth are placed so as to draw money back in. You remember that. So accompanying this letter was a list. There are 102 agencies listed for supplemental services. Of the 102, 76 were for profit. For profit. The current emphasis on tracking students' progress, the current emphasis on calculating that the value that teachers add to each individual student's quality of education often requires digital electronic monitoring. And so corporations make money selling to school districts such monitoring systems. I had a friend who did such work, he lived in in the San Francisco Silicon Valley area. He lived in San Francisco, but he worked in Silicon Valley. And his job was to sell school districts, not only in the state of California, but across the country and the world. He's now working in Southeast Asia doing something similar, selling such products to school districts. Well, these systems are, it helps corporations generate millions upon millions of dollars, all on the basis of systemic failure, on the premise of systemic failure. So what does she suggest? What evidence does she use to argue that, look, not only is the corporate reformist agenda based upon the false premise of systemic failure, but it's designed to generate monetary money for private interests. And of course, she has much more evidence on that second point than from what I have here than what I've worked through here. And then finally, evaluate her argument, and then take a stand on do her suggestions for an improvement of public schooling make sense. This issue is important. I keep this. Well, I keep this issue on the forefront in the class because, look, while No Child Left Behind in high school, we've somewhat backed off high stakes testing in this country. Well, I say we backed off. We've at least become somewhat concerned about what it is doing to our schools. As many of you have already noted, what high stakes testing, as it comes out of No Child Left Behind and carried over to Race to the Top, has done, and it still continues. It certainly has narrowed the curriculum such that is narrowed the curriculum and scripted instruction, just depending, of course, where students are and teachers are, to the point of rendering schooling anemic in meaning. And so we as a society have become, certainly the state, I mean, we've backed off of high stakes testing. There's legislation, parents have put pressure on our legislators here in the state of Florida, such that the legislation is passed to reduce the amount of standardized testing in schools, though we still use it as a means of control, as Ravitch is making that argument, but not as strongly as others have and will. Half of teachers' yearly annual evaluation is tied to student standardized test scores. To the point, and the issue is not so much that teachers, and so this is of material concern to you all. Folks have argued, and I would argue as well, that while teachers need to be held accountable for their work, you certainly, if you're in a craft, I think you want to be held accountable to the standards inherent in that activity, for sure. But you certainly don't want to be held to standards that are external to that activity, and that you have no input in creating, extending, and reconceptualizing. In public perception, there's a long history to this, and which I just can't really capture in a video. We would need time and discussion for this, but the teacher assignment, teacher pay, merit pay, is tied to performance on standardized tests, value added. Teachers, and so in the public perception, teachers need to be held accountable. They're the ones who, ultimately, somebody has to take responsibility for the systemic failure of public schooling, the argument is. And that has to be placed upon teachers, the point of contact with the public in schools. We need to hold them accountable. And when teachers argue against, and so the upshot is that when teachers argue against the accountability measures applied to them, then it is viewed by public, an unknowing public, that they don't want to be held accountable, that there's a ossification of office, that they want to be unresponsive, unresponsible to a democratic public, and so on. And that they're selfish, they don't care about the public. I mean, the arguments go on in different nuanced types of ways. But teachers simply, the fact of the matter is, teachers, all teachers will argue that, look, we need to be held accountable. We want to be responsible for our work, the work that we do. We want to be held to a standard of excellence. But we don't want to be held accountable for things which we have no control over. And we've known for a very long period of time, that we have no control over to whom our students go home. We have no control over the material resources they have available to them at home. The amount of time a parent has available to spend reinforcing lessons at school, learned at school, or introduced at school. We have no control of those conditions outside of schooling, but they are instrumental. They are of material consequence in the schools. And so if you're going to be, I keep this this type of Ravitch's argument. Well, Ravitch's argument is ever the more relevant now, given the current administration, Betsy DeVos, as a Secretary of Education, because she certainly represents a corporate reformist agenda, hands down. There's no disputing that. You just simply look at the policies that they've argued for. But this is of a material concern to you all as you're teaching, if you're going into teaching, and if you're going to, as the old argument goes, if there's going to be a movement that a teacher, if there's going to be correction of these problems, it's got to involve a ground effort, a grassroots effort on the part of teachers to take stewardship over their work. And this is an essential part of their work, or current condition of their essential part of the current conditions of their work right now. So this little video just serves to give you some background. I can't go through all the details because I simply don't have means to provide you all the handouts and so forth that I typically have in a face-to-face course to enhance this discussion, to engage you in this discussion. But I think the book speaks for itself. She's straightforward. She uses language that is straightforward. You just simply have to get through it. But when I ask for evidence, I'm talking about the particular facts she is using to argue what she is arguing. So when you write the paper, you want to be sure that you identify and explain what those facts are, and a range of the facts, not just simply one or two little pieces, but you want to give the reader a sufficient representation of the range of facts that she is employing in both prongs of her argument, because it's a two-pronged argument. Remember, keep that in mind. She's arguing that it's the reformist agenda is based upon false claims of systematic failure, and two, that it's an attempt to generate monetary profit for private interest. You all have a good day.